Hey guys, Shan this side. Welcome to Concept and Coding, and today we are going to see the Springboot JPA part 1. And let's start without wasting any time. So here if you see that till now whatever we have done, it's mostly a part of application logic. Now we have reached to a stage where we have to insert data into the database. How we can do that? So that's where the JPA JDBC comes into the picture. Okay. So before even jumping into the JPA, we have to first understand the complete sequence, right? What all components actually get involved into this. So here if you see that, let's say that you are writing a Spring Boot application, you have an application logic, or you have written so many beans. Okay. Now what you do is, if you have to use JPA, what's the sequence? What happens is you interact with the APIs which is provided by JPA. So always remember that JPA is mostly an interface, right? It provided APIs which you can interact with, but it do not provide you the implementation. Implementation is provided by another component, let's say in this case Hibernate, or if you don't want to use Hibernate, there is something like OpenJPA, right? Or there are, I think, Eclipse Link. And so these are different implementation of JPA. Okay, so your application talks to JPA. JPA internally has to be implemented by some other component which you decide which you want to use. So generally Hibernate is the most popular one. So Hibernate internally talks to or utilize JDBC API. So again, JDBC is again an interface. So Hibernate uses its APIs, its interfaces, and then there are specific DB drivers. So this DB drivers is nothing but an implementation of this JDBC APIs. Okay. So for example, you are using a MySQL DB. Okay. You are using a MySQL DB. Then there would be a specific DB driver for it. Okay, let's say it is connector J DB driver, which is very specific for MySQL, which knows how to connect to MySQL, and it provided the implementation of JDBC API. Similarly, if you have something called Postgres SQL, okay, then it has its own DB driver. It has its own DB driver. Okay. So depending upon which DB you are using, specific, that's why I written specific DB driver is required. Okay. This DB drivers is nothing but an implementation of JDBC APIs. This JDBC, right, Java database connectivity helps you to connect to a database. Okay. Through this API, you can connect, you can query, you can fetch the data. Okay. But remember, JDBC is nothing but an API interface. Actual work is done by drivers itself. If you are using MySQL, then MySQL drivers know how to fetch the data. Okay. Then this JDBC, now there is something called ORM framework is built up. Object Relational Mapping Framework. So this is nothing but a bridge between Java object and your relational databases. Okay, so here if you see that in the JDBC and specific DB driver, everything we are in the form of SQL, right? We write queries and we try to connect through DB, create DB, or fetch the data, insert, everything is in SQL form. But here with the ORM framework, where this JPA and let's say its implementation Hibernate we are using, if this comes into the picture, we don't have to, your application don't have to directly work with the JDBC APIs. You don't have to write SQL queries to insert. You can directly work with Java objects itself. Okay. Through Java objects itself, you can maintain your relational databases. So remember, JPA, JDBC is just for maintaining relational databases. So before going to JPA, let's recall JDBC, Java Database Connectivity. Okay. So here if you see that it provides an interface to make connection with DB, query DB and process the result. Whatever the data we get out of DB, we also have to process it. So it provides an API through which we can process it. And implementation is provided by specific DB drivers. If you are using MySQL DB, then it has its specific drivers, right? So likewise, so here if you see MySQL, if you are using this DB, what is the driver? Connector J. And this is the class we have to load for it. If you are using Postgres SQL, this is the driver and this is the class through which we can load this driver. Similarly, S2, which is in-memory relational database, and its driver is this one, S2 database engine, and this is the class to load this driver. So this driver, now anybody say that what is the driver? You know that driver is nothing but an implementation of JDBC APIs. So this expose, JDBC API expose that, okay, get me connection, insert, let's say, update, delete. But is it actually doing it? No, it's just an interface. This drivers is actually has all the implementation, how to get a connection, how to insert it, how to update it. See that from your application wise, you don't have to worry about the specific driver code because you are dealing with the JDBC APIs. You do just get connection. Your application would do get connection. Okay, you do update, let's say, an update and you provide it. It's provided as the interface, right? Now it's driver which is abstracted to us, how it actually converted to something which is understood by relational database. We don't have to worry about it. So you don't worry like, okay, if I am using MySQL driver, my code will get changed. If I am using Postgres SQL, lot of code changes would be done. No, nothing like this. You already got it, right? Why? Because we are just invoking that get connection. Now this specific driver will take care of getting the connection. So if you change from MySQL to Postgres, your code will not change. You are still calling get connection only. Internal implementation will change and that's okay. So you can use anything. Okay. So let's start very basic using JDBC without a Spring Boot. Let's say that if you are not using a Spring Boot, how you would make a connection, what are the challenges, what that Spring Boot resolves actually. And once we knows that, then ultimately we move to JPA. So see this class first. So very basic example, I have created one public class database connection. As the class name, this is used to create a connection, database connection. So I have created one method called get connection. Okay, and it's returning me the connection object. So now here if you see that the first step in getting a connection is to load the driver, into the JVM. So when you do class.for name and you provide the driver, this is the class. Okay, so I am using S2, this one, in memory. I don't want to install MySQL and start its server. For testing, we can always use S2. And I told you, right, doesn't matter. Like your code will not change at all. Either you use MySQL, Postgres or S2, right? You are just calling APIs, JDBC APIs. So no matter what, first step is you have to load the driver. So I am using S2, so S2 driver. If you are using MySQL, you have to load the MySQL driver. So this is the first step. Now once the driver is loaded into the JVM, the second step is to establish a connection with DB. Okay, so here if I am using, there is a class called driver manager and you do .get connection. So you pass the URL. So now here if you see this URL, we are using JDBC. Yes. What is the DB type we are using? S2, not MySQL, not Postgres. I am using S2. Even the S2 has two variants, like in memory. In memory is like once till your application is running, data is there in the DB. As soon as your application shut down, data is also gone. So it's a transient data. So I'm using memory, in memory, like till my application is up, data is there. As soon as my application is shut down, the data will be lost. There is another variant that you can even change it to that to persist the data even your application shut down also. So but I am using the transient flavor of it, and this is the DB name which I want to create. So I am creating a user DB. So when I do get connection and give the URL, if this DB is not there, it will create. If it is already there, it will do a connection for that one. Okay, and username and password. So default username for S2 is SA, which is I think system administrator, and password is nothing. So you need this to get a connection of your database. Okay, so first is load a driver, second is establish a connection. So this is two things are present into my database connection class. Now here if you see another class which I have written, user DAO class. Okay, in this DAO, the first method I have like creating a table. Generally understanding is whenever you are running your application, database is table is already present. But since we are just starting, I have also created one method where I am creating a table also. Okay, DB is already created here. If not present, it will create a DB, user DB. So inside this DB, it will create a table, one method. Second method, I have written create user. Okay. Third is I have written to read a user. So three methods I have written. So see what happening is like how you can do that. So in this one, first thing, whenever you have to query, insert, update, delete, create anything, first thing you need is get a connection of a database. So it creating a new database connection object. So it getting an instance of this class and then calling the get connection method. It calling this method. What this method does is it will load the driver. It will get one fresh connection of this database and provide this connection. Once you got the connection, then you can run the query. So I have written one query, create table users. So I am creating a users table only with two column, three column. One is user ID, which is auto incremented. Another is user name, and the third one is age. Okay, so this is the table I am creating. So here, whatever the SQL query string you have created, now you just with this statement, you just execute update. Okay, so it will create your table. Also notice that there is, if any exception comes, you have to handle the SQL exception. And in the final block, you have to close the resources. You have to close the statement. You have to close the connection. Similarly, create user. Whenever you have to create one user, okay, the first step is get the connection, create a new database connection instance, and then call this method. It will give you one connection, database connection. Then you write your SQL query, which you want to insert into users, username, age, and user ID is auto incremented already. So no problem in that. So these two values I want to dynamically insert. So I can use prepared statement. Okay. So connection dot prepared statement, you provide this SQL query, and here these two dynamic values would be set the values like set a string. First one is a string user name. So index 1, provide the username, whatever it is coming. The second question mark is that integer, which is age. So I'm doing set int, index is 2, and the age, whatever it is coming. And then simply prepared query, execute update. So this will insert one row. Okay, and similarly you have to catch the SQL exception, and in the finally block you have to close the prepared query and the DB connection. If you see the third method, read query, the read users, it is also exactly same. So I think now you are understanding the crux. You have to get the connection, then you can use prepared statement, and you can use this prepared statement to run the SQL query. So I run the SQL query, select asterisk from user. So this is the SQL query string. So connection.prepared statement, I provided this SQL query. So there is no dynamic value, so I don't need to set anything. I just run prepared query, execute query. When I run this execute query, it will give me a result set. Result set is nothing but a list of rows. So I am iterating and just concatenating and printing it. Okay. So you have to handle the SQL exception, and finally you have to close it, resources. So this is very basic plain JDBC we are using. No Springboot is used here. Okay, so I will show you running it, but what is the problem you are seeing with this? So there are so many boiler code we are writing. First is driver class loading. You have to load the driver, right? Class.forename. Then you have to make a DB connection. Now here, if you see, you are doing a data driver manager dot get connection. Hey, give me one connection of the database, and you are providing the URL, username, password, and this will get you one connection. So you have to manually get the database connection. Third is exception handling. So here, if you see what exception you are getting, SQL exception. This is very high level or abstracted exception, I would say. So SQL exception can be of anything. Maybe a primary key violation, duplicate key found. You are not able to insert. Like there are so many different ways through which your query fails, but it gives a very high level abstracted error, SQL exception. So you have to do a lot of kind of if else check. Okay, if this is the issue, then okay, do this. So here SQL exception, I would say that it's not very clear. Okay, closing of the DB connection and other objects like a statement. So here if you see that every time you take out a connection or use a resource, now here you are creating a prepared statement, executing the query. In the finally block, you ultimately have to close the DB connection and close the prepared query also. Because if you don't do that, there is a possibility of memory leak also. So as normal JDBC, you have to handle the closing of the DB connection also. And the last one is manual handling of DB connection pool. So here if you see that currently every time somebody is calling new instance dot get connection, I am blindly creating one connection. But it is not an ideal way. Generally ideal way would be like, okay, there should be one pool of JDBC connection pool in which already I have pre-created few connections. Use it. Once use it, return it back to the pool. So you have to manually add it or handle it, DB connections pool. Okay, with the JDBC. So these are the few issues with the plain JDBC. But before I jump to Springboot JDBC, how it handles it, let's see that. So the plain JDBC, the same thing. I have database connection class, first class loader. We are loading it, and then we are establishing a DB connection. And in the user DAO, we are creating a user table first. And then I have also have a create user method and read user method. Okay. So every time I use it, I handle the exception, and also in the finally block, I close it properly. So I have just written the comment here. So just to that we have to close it here. So let's start the server. Okay. And here I have a user controller, which is like plain JDBC is like get user call plain JDBC. So here I am using get user. This I am hitting this get API. Okay. So this get API just for testing purpose. You can say that. Don't go with like why in the get why we are doing a create and this one. So this is just for testing purpose that my control comes here. So once the controls will come here, so let me put a debugger point. Let me start in a debug mode. So here, once the control comes here, so what happen is I am creating a user DAO object. Now I am creating two users, X and Y. So I am creating X and Y, and then ultimately I am doing read user. So in the read user, the same thing I told you, right? First get an object of the connection and your query, and you can use prepared query to run this execute query, and you can iterate it to print it here. So I am iterated it and return. So success is printed, and if you see the console log, the 2 rows got printed. This is the user ID, which is auto incremented 1 and 2. This is the user name, and this is the age. Okay. So this is currently in memory. Now Spring Boot helps to remove all this boiler code for us. So now let's see using JDBC with Spring Boot. So the first thing you have to do is include the dependency in pom.xml. So this is Spring Boot starter JDBC. Okay, so this is for JDBC interfaces and all it will bring. And the second dependency you need for this S2 database we are using, right, in memory one. So this is for the database. You can replace it with MySQL or Postgres, whichever you like. So currently I'm using in memory S2, so I'm added its dependency. Okay, so Spring Boot provide JDBC template class, which helps to remove all the boiler code which we see at top. How? Now let's see that. Once you have added the dependency, now let's see this example. So now here if you see, first I have created one basic Pojo of user ID, user name, age, and its getter and setter. Very basics user class. Now the second I have created user repository class. I have given a name user repository class and annotated with @repository. It works as @component. So it will help us to create a bean of user repository and also help us in the scanning of those bean, like what @component does. The second is that at the top in the plain JDBC you see SQL exception comes, right? But here this repository, whenever Spring Boot sees that okay, it is annotated with @repository, any SQL exception comes, it gives a granular level of exception. Okay, we'll see how. So after creating this user class, Pojo class, I am creating a user repository annotated with @repository. And here if you see that I have added a dependency in this one of JDBC template. This is the class which I am talking about, which helps us to remove all the boiler code. So JDBC template, I have auto wired it. Okay, so bean will get inserted into it. So here I have also have the same methods I have written. One is create, one is insert, and another is read. 3 methods, same like above. So create table. Now here if you see JDBC template execute. Okay, and you can directly write your query. In the execute, you can directly write your plain SQL query itself. In the insert, JDBC template dot update, you provide your insert query. Now if your insert query is need to be like certain values which need to be dynamically filled, it can be added like this. There are different methods. I will tell you, don't go inside like how this update is used. I will tell you what are the different ways. But currently understand this, like you are just calling the method JDBC template dot update, put the query and all the values which has to be goes into this field. And similarly get users, what I am doing is I have returned the query. I am doing just JDBC template dot query and given the query. Now here I am just iterating over the result set. I will go later into deep what I am doing it. Now the difference you might be seeing that I am not creating DB connection here. Okay, I am not written any finally block where I am closing the DB connection or closing the prepared statement, anything, nothing. All I am using is just JDBC template execute just for executing the plain query. there is something like update, where for more complex queries where you have to dynamically fill the values. And it also provides for read like dot query, which is used for fetching the data. So this is your second class which you have to create. And here if you see the service class, which uses this actually. This is more of a helper class. I would say that this is your business logic class. Okay, so this is, I have annotated with @component. You can also annotate it with @service. Okay, so I have auto wired this user repository. Okay, now anybody wants to create a table, they will invoke this, and ultimately it will call user repository create table. Insert user, this will ultimately go and call this method. Get user, ultimately this, and call this method. It will get the list. Currently I'm doing my business logic is I'm just simply system.out.println and I'm writing and simply return the user. Okay, so this class is nothing but a user service class, is nothing but which is calling the repository class. Okay, and it is your business logic class. Like after fetching the data from the DB, any business logic you have to perform, you can perform here at this level. And the last is you have to use an application.properties. Now here if you see that we are providing certain properties, data source property, like I am providing the URL. So now here if you see at the top, Plain JDBC, you are providing the you are doing a connection and then providing a URL, username, password, driver link. All you have to do here is in the Springboot is in this application.properties, you provide what is the URL, the same thing. This is your DB. I am using memory version of H2 and JDBC. The driver, username, password. Okay. So now this data source object in Springboot helps with two things. One is database connection. It creates a connection, returns it, manage it, and also it helps with the connection pool. Okay, it manages the connection pool. So this data source object. So internally Spring Boot help us to do whatever we were doing, class.forName. Okay, then create a connection and everything Spring Boot does it. And surprisingly, I will tell you, Spring Boot also by default provide us a connection pool also. It is Hikari CP connection pool, Hikari connection pool. I will show you the demo, but before proceed further, is this clear? Like how it is helping us resolving it. So here if you see driver class loading, are we doing anywhere driver class loading? No, we are not. In the Spring Boot JDBC, we are not doing class.forName and the driver path. We are not doing anywhere. This is just a business logic class. So here if you see, we are just directly using repository and application.properties. We are not doing driver class. So JDBC template loaded at the time of application startup in driver manager class. Let's see that. So now let's see the driver manager class, and I'm just starting an application. So driver manager, what we are saying is JDBC loaded at the time of application startup itself. So now I'm starting the application in a debug mode. Now here if you see, during application startup itself, it is doing class.forName for us. Earlier we used to do in the plain JDBC, now it is doing it. Okay. And here if you see that it has the data which we provided or.h2.driver in the application.properties. Okay. So one thing is driver class loading is now get abstracted from us. JDBC template does it. Database connection making. Now you can ask, hey, in this, when is the database connection happen? Whenever we run any particular query through JDBC template, like dot update, dot query, At that point of time, it tried to create a correct connection. Okay, so connection making from the, either it has to make a new connection, it will create that time, or it has to take from the pool, it will do that time itself. Now let's say that insert user, I am trying to insert. So if we go inside this update this method, it do execute. If you go inside this, it do this data source utils get connection. Okay, so if you go inside this, it will actually handles like the connection making, do get connection from the data source. Okay, exception handling. So exception in plain JDBC, we get very abstracted SQL exception. But in JDBC template, we get granular error like duplicate key exception, query timeout exception. So if you go this package, org.springframework.dow package. So let's see that package here. If we see this package, dow, org.springframework.dow package, these are the different type of exception it provides. Cannot acquire lock exception, data access exception, data integrity violation exception, duplicate key exception, empty results exception. So there are different type of exceptions can come, query timeout exception. So all this JDBC template do mapping internally from, instead of just throwing SQL exception, it throws a granular level of exception. And through Spring Boot, in the previous video, I have already told you how you can handle a exception of any particular type. Okay, but you get some granular level exception, and you can handle it properly. It's just not very like abstraction. Some SQL exception happen. What? We don't know. Closing of the DB connection and other resources. Now again, you can ask me, Shreyansh, like in the Spring Boot JDBC, we are just using JDBC template to execute the query. Okay, plain query update. But where are we closing it? Again, that is handled by your JDBC template on itself. Now let's go to here, let's say JDBC template dot update. I am trying to insert, right? If you go inside this, in the finally block, it do clean up parameters. Okay. So here it has a proper knowledge that whether I have to close the connection or whether I have to put it back into the pool. Okay. So you don't have to handle it. That is also handled by your JDBC itself. And the last thing is, hey Shreyansh, what about the DB connection pool? Still here, I do not see where we are writing the connection pool logic. Like in a connection pool, I have only this 5 JDBC connection pool, and only this 5 would be used. Who is doing that? So here, if you see, when you have defined this application.properties in data source, okay, so means you are relying on Spring Boot that, hey, you use the data source, the data source object, right? It helps you to connect to the database and helps you to manage connection pool. But here we just provided like what is the driver, what is the URL, username, password. We didn't tell like what data source we want to use. There are different data sources which we can use, but here we haven't told it. So Spring Boot use by default Hikari data source, and Hikari data source also provide Hikari connection pool. So now here, if you see, Hikari provide default JDBC connection pool, that is Hikari CP connection pool with minimum and maximum pool size of 10. And we can change the configuration in application.properties. So in application.properties, you can put like spring.data source, Hikari maximum pool is 10 and the minimum is 5. By default is 10. So here, if you see, we can check like how it is making a connection. So Hikari data source, whenever it will do get connection, let's see that. Okay, so Hikari data source, it came. So here if you see Hikari pool, it is using connection timeout, idle timeout, maximum pool size 10, minimum is 10. Okay. So Spring Boot, actually this Hikari is actually very efficient and it's very fast actually. And no matter if you are using SQL, Postgres or S2, Spring Boot by default uses this only, this data source only. But if you want to use any other specific JDBC connection pool, you don't want to use Hikari, you want to use some other one, right? Maybe some from Apache or some other JDBC connection pool. Then instead of putting into the application.properties, you don't have to put into application.properties. Then you can, in your configuration, @configuration class, app config class, you can create a bean of data source and then you can use whichever data source you want. Here in this, for example, I am using the same Hikari data source only. Okay. But you can change it to any other JDBC connection pool which is available and you can use it on your own. So here driver class name, JDB, instead of now application.properties, I am providing the configuration for the data source like this, JDBC pool, username, password like this. Okay, now here I don't need to provide in the application.properties. Now this data source would be used. So currently here I am using Hikari only, but you can use any, you can replace it with anything. Okay. And yeah, we can show the complete demo here. So here if you see that, let's see that I am calling this API JDBC. Okay, first it will do create table. User table is created. If it's not, then user 1 is added, user 2 is added. And after that, what it is doing is we are doing get user. So we are using user service dot get user, and this get user service layer calls repository. It do get users. So ultimately how many users we created? 2. So I got a list of 2 users and I am iterating it and printing it. So 2 times it printed and ultimately it returns list of user itself, finish. So here if you see 2 users it returns, and also I was printing it, so 2 users got printed. Okay. So JDBC template in Spring Boot has couple of methods, very frequently used method I will tell you. One is update and it takes 2 parameters. One is SQL string and another is var variable arguments. Okay. So this update method can be used for insert, update and delete operation. So like this, insert into user. So I have written my SQL query as a string and 2 dynamic values which I need to insert. Okay, so this is my string. Now I'm using JDBC template dot update your query, and second is variable arguments, like variable arguments 1, 2, 3, could be anything, right? So 2 dynamic, right? So one is your string, second is your integer, this one. Okay. Similarly, it can be used for update. So this is one method, very commonly used method of JDBC template. Another is this one for updating, update the same your query, and the second is prepared statement setter, PSS you can say. It is also you can use for insert, update, delete. It is just for like more granular level, or you can say that more if your queries are very complex, then prepared statement setter can be useful. The similar first thing is insert query, like you can write your string. Okay, you have to set dynamic values. Now I am, instead of using the previous, I am now using prepared statement setter. JDBC template dot update, the first parameter is your string query. Now second is prepared statement setter. So here if you see JDBC template update string SQL. So yeah, this prepared statement setter. Here if you see, it is a functional interface. Okay, so you can use lambda expression and it has only one method which need to be implemented. Okay, so one method which accept prepared statement. So that's why I'm using lambda expression. In Java playlist, I've already explained it in depth how you can use lambda expression. So here I am just providing the implementation for that get values itself, that whatever the prepared statement, set the string. The first one is a string username. So for the first index, it's a string. Second index, this one, second is integer, right? So I am providing age. So this is 1, 2, this is our indexing. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So this is 1, this is 2, another question mark, this would be 3. So this way you can add it. Okay. So you can use it for insert, update, delete. These are the two ways. Similarly, now you have to fetch it, right? So one is query. Query method, it takes one flavor is, it takes two parameter. One is string, which is your SQL query. Second is row mapper. Now it is used to fetch, get multiple rows. You have to fetch multiple rows. So now here, if you see this query, the JDBC template.query, the first one is your select query string, and the second one is your row mapper. So this row mapper is a functional interface which has one method, map row, which takes two parameters. So that's why this two parameters, and whenever this method get invoked, this map row, this is the implementation should run. Okay, so see that what might be happening inside. So in the user repository, when I am doing get users, let's see, it might be doing query. It going inside query. Here execute query. After it executed the query, it got a result set. So result set can be like 10 rows, 20 rows. Then it has to extract data out of it. Row mapper. Now it is here. If you see, it is iterating over this each row set, each row, and calling the map row. Okay. So now this will get executed for each row set. There are total 5 rows. Then for each row, I am creating a user object and do a mapping. Like in the row, this column row.getInt user ID. So I am putting into this user ID field. It's just a mapping between a column and the object, user object. So row set.get string is like username. I am putting into username like this. And ultimately it will return a list. It will just keep on adding into the result list and ultimately return this list of user. The second flavor is query for list. Again, first parameter is a string and second is class. The purpose is to get single column of multiple rows. Single column of multiple rows. So here JDBC template.query for list. Provide the query, select username from users. If there are total 10 users, you will get username for all the 10 users only. So one column. Whenever you want to fetch the one specific column for multiple rows, then go ahead, use this query for list. Okay. So the second parameter is class type. So this username is string.class. Okay, so here if you see query for list, and we can search for it here. Query for list, what it does, get single column row mapper. So it is a single column. Its mapping is based on single column, like a single type string. Then the third query could be like query for object. The first is your SQL query, then arguments and the required type. Get single row. This is used for fetching a single row. So JDBC template that query for object. The first is your SQL query. Select asterisk from user where user ID equals to, it could be dynamic. So that's where your second parameter comes into the picture, object array. So I'm creating an object array, only one, right, in the array. So I'm putting like it should be replaced with 1. If there are more question marks, you can just put into arrays. It will sequentially, it will update the question mark. So it will change user ID equals to 1 with this. And the third one is required type is the object in which this row has to be mapped to. So I want to map to the user. So internally it will do mapping, make use of getter and setters of user, and it will map this each column of this row into this user object. And the last is like query for object, SQL and required type. Get only single value. It is used for get only single value. Like JDBC template get query for object, select count asterisk from user. You do integer dot class. So now here if you see, it return only one single value. So if you have any requirement where you get only one single value, then you can use this get for object. So these are generally different flavors which JDBC template provides, which you can do to insert, update, delete or fetch the data. Okay. So, but with this, I hope that at least this JDBC and this driver part should be properly clear, where this exactly comes into the picture, how you can connect to the DB, what all problems are there in the plain JDBC, what Springboot JDBC resolves it and how it resolves it. Because then only it's makes sense to understand ORM framework and JPA and Hibernate. Okay, so next we will start with the ORM, object relational mapping. But we'll see you in the part 2. But if the part 1, if you have any doubts, let's discuss in the comment section. Thank you. Bye.